All right, so we're going to talk about tidying data, right? Or basically reshaping data to get it in a proper format. And the reason for this is once we have a data frame that's tidy, it becomes a lot easier to do some of the other tasks that we do in a normal statistical computing workflow or data science workflow, right? So to go into visualizing our data or maybe doing some summary statistics or computing group by summary statistics that we have covered already. A lot of that depends on the shape of your data, right? And we're going to see that sometimes, depending on the shape of our data, it makes it much more difficult to actually do some of these follow-on tasks. So, for example, if we look at this data set, we can see that we have pretty obvious variables, right? Variables and observations. We can look, we have 4 different variables, and these are just based off of aircraft and the flying hours for those aircraft. And so we have these are all bomber type of aircraft, and we have different types of bombers. We have B-1s, and we have B-2s and B-52s and some other aircraft. And this just shows the flying hours that each one of these aircraft has in a given year, right? So we could see we have the type, the MD, and that's just the kind of like the model of the aircraft, and we have the year that the aircraft flew and how many hours it flew, right? So when we have data like this, it would make it quite easy for us to go in and do some visualization. Maybe we want to do some summary statistics based off of the type of aircraft, or maybe we want to get the sum of all flying hours across the years, right? And we can do that in this kind of format. But when we look at data like this, it becomes far less obvious in how we would do follow-on analysis with this. And we can see the problem that we have here is we have the year variable spread out as the column headings, and then we have the flying hours underneath those. So the problem here is we actually have a data set that we would consider is wider than it should be. And this is where we have a variable, like I said, year is represented as the columns. So what we actually want to do here is reshape this in a way where our column values here are represented as a variable, and then all the flying hours we see under here is also represented as its own variable, right? So we'd have to reshape our data in order to get it in that format. Likewise, if we look at this data set, we see we also have some concerns. Here we have an output variable, and this output basically just means we have different types of categories that we are capturing some type of value for. For example, we have flying hours for this aircraft, we have the gallons of fuel used, and we have the cost to fly that aircraft, right? And then we get to the next year, and we have flying hours, gallons, and costs. So what we actually have in this case is we have a data set that's considered longer than it should be, because what we would want is to have flying hours as its own variable with the values for those flying hours underneath it. Gallons would be a separate column or its own variable with the value of gallons underneath that. And cost as well would be its own variable with the values for costs underneath that. Right? So in this case, we actually want to take this data frame that is longer and we want to shape it to make it wider, right? So both of these problems, in this example, in this one, just has to do with we have the information we need. We just need to reshape our data frame in a way that we can use that information as appropriate variables, right? And this is what the idea of tidy data gets at. And a data set is considered tidy if each variable is in its own column, right? So that's where we have, in this case, we'd have flying hours, gallons, and costs. Those are its own variables. We'd want that to be in its own columns. Or in this case, we have year spread out across the column. We would want that to be in its own column, and we'd want these flying hour values to be in its own column as well. Right? Then we want each observation in its own row, and each value is in its own cell. Once we have a data set that meets these requirements, it makes it so much easier to do follow-on analysis such as visualization, summary statistics, or even getting into machine learning. So that's what this lesson is going to cover. And you're going to learn a few key Panda functions that allow us to kind of reshape data frames. You're going to learn about melting, and melting makes a wide data set longer, right? So you can kind of see here in this GIF I have here, you can see here's a wider data set, and we want to melt it and make it longer. Then we're going to learn about pivoting. Pivoting is about making long data wider. So that is reformatting a data set that is initially longer than it should be, such as this one that you see right here, and then it's going to pivot to make it wider and add more columns, right? And then we have some special alternative functions like pivot table, and this is going to operate the same way that pivot does, but we can actually handle multiple indexes. So we're going to cover these in this lesson, and this is going to give you the knowledge you need in order to kind of reshape your data frame depending on how we want variables to be represented.